how do you think the average American engages with politics today? Do you think that's a problem? Do you think it can be changed? Let's start there. Real quick, so that everybody knows who you are, would you like to introduce yourself and then give people an idea of who you are and what we're, or just, yeah, introduce yourself.
Sure. Is this a live thing? What is this?
Yep.
What are we doing?
Absolutely live. I guess we didn't talk too much about the format. Okay, wait. Okay, I'll back up a little bit. Sorry, hold on. Also, I don't have a camera hooked up. Sorry, just got this program at once. Hold on. Okay, sorry. I'm kind of messy. I just got home like an hour ago. All right, don't judge me too much. Okay, I reached out to you like probably 4 months ago, I think. Somebody recommended me your book, Politics is for Power, and I started to get more and more. I don't know how much internet terminology you're familiar with. I'll say election pilled in terms of our political system. And I reached out to you to have a chat. We tried to set something up, and then I was juggling like a million different things, and it ended up lapsing for like a month or two, and then I didn't have a chance to email you back, and then we reconnected again recently, so you are here to chat. You are most well known in my community for being the author of Politics is for Power, and I believe you're also a professor, and you teach? Yeah.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, do you want to, is there anything else you want to say about introducing yourself so people have an idea of who you are, where to find you?
Sure, yeah. I live in Boston. I'm on Twitter, but I try to stay away sometimes.
Good choice.
Yeah, I work on, I do research on voting rights. I do a lot of court case work on voting rights, and then I do work on civic engagement, and that's what that last book was about.
All right, that's awesome. Cancel, boom, boom. Okay, we don't have, I was trying to get a camera on screen, but don't worry about it.
Oh, sorry, was I supposed to, I pressed cancel, but I didn't know, read it. Was I supposed to say something?
No, you're fine, don't worry about it. So we don't actually have a particular topic to talk about right now, because I flew in today and I just landed like 3 hours ago, so I haven't had time to prep anything. Is there anything specific you want to go over? Otherwise, I can just start asking you questions related to your book or related to political stuff in general. Because I think you're really interesting. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just love to hear about your community too, and who's who we got here. I was excited to see. I think one of the folks who is a regular listener for you sent me a nice email saying like a bunch of folks gathered in Omaha. I thought it was exciting, so I wanted to just hear about you guys too.
Yeah. All right. Cool. Well, so basically, I am a politics / philosophy / video game. Have you ever heard of live streaming before?
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah.
Not
okay.
much.
Okay. Yeah. That's basically that's kind of where I grew out of. I'm putting your camera up on stream. Okay. Here you go. That's basically like what I came out of, and then we've always kind of talked about like interesting topics. So it might be science, it might be philosophy, it might be political stuff. And then I would say that around like in the 2016 era for sure, that type of content that I did started to grow a ton. With the Trump stuff and everything, basically my big interest or my big pull into everything was I was just fascinated by how much like just misinformation was out there. That just blew my mind. I didn't really care too much about like people's political orientations. It was just more just like so much stuff is said that's just totally not even close to being correct. Like it's just in different realities. So I kind of got into politics in around 2016, more full time. My reputation is for like debate, I guess online in terms of arguing over topics. And over the years, I've kind of been looking for more like what are ways that I can channel my audience into having more effective how can I be more effective to actually do real political stuff and not just scream at people on the internet, which is like what 99% of internet politics is. Actually more to the point of your book, what almost like 90% of all like politics and media is, not just on the internet, but even on TV. So yeah, I started interviewing like people running for Congress in different districts so that I could kind of get the message out more. I try to talk about more local issues, but it's harder with an international audience. And then the Senate runoffs came for Georgia, and I knew that this was like a monumental election. And something that I was curious about was I wonder if I could mobilize an audience in person to do like actual political work. And I've heard that like canvassing and door knocking is supposed to be like, this is like the best. If you can get people to actually go out and knock on doors, this is like one of the most effective uses of political power. So I did a fan meetup in Atlanta, and I was hoping I could get like 20 people to show up. That would be awesome. I was more ready for 5 or 10, and I got over 100 people to show up, and I was like, oh, this is amazing. So I started organizing like canvassing down in Georgia. I think we did 3 different weekend meetups where we knocked on doors. I think by the end of it, my group had knocked on about 20,000 households for communicating with voters and everything, which I thought was super cool. And then I'm just trying to take that idea and fine tune it. And now my eyes are set on, there's a local election in Omaha, which is my hometown. I lived there for 30 years. And there's a mayoral candidate, Mark Gudgel, that I feel really strongly about. And I'm trying to see if I can like recreate that type of activity there. And a large, and then bringing this back around, one of the large pushes in that direction is reading your book was super awesome. If you met me like 2 or 3 years ago, and everything I tell you is not going to be unique, I very much had the idea of corporations run politics. There's no point in voting. All of it is a waste of time. You're not going to affect any real change. It's all bought and paid for, blah, blah, blah. And then slowly over the years, I'd kind of been moved back from that position where it was more like, hey, actually, I think our political system works really well. It's actually like it works incredibly effectively. The problem is just that not many people take advantage of it. Like all the policies that appear at local levels, actually they should be that way because the only people that vote are like, wealthy, affluent, white men that are older, or not even white men and women, but like older, whiter, like it's certain demographics that vote. And then when I started to look at things through that lens, stuff started to make sense a lot more. And then I don't remember who it was exactly. Somebody recommended me your book. And then I read it, and it was like the reaffirming of everything that kind of like recently I had started to come into, where your book opens with basically just like regular normal people that managed to secure a meaningful amount of political power in their local scenes, and then it talks about how people in general engage with politics in terms of political hobbyism, and so reading your book, doing stuff in real life afterwards, being inspired by that, and then all of the recent stuff, and then finally getting to talk to you has been my whole kind of like arc. Sorry, that was a huge mouthful of everything, but that's basically my community, who I am, and then how we got our way to you, I guess. Yeah.
I love that. I'm honored to be part of that.
Yeah, thanks. It's cool that I can talk to you.
So where should we start?
Where should we start? Let's go general overview. How do you think the average American engages with politics today? Do you think that's a problem? Do you think it can be changed? Let's start there. Well. Whoa.
I lost you for a while there.
Yep. Okay. Sorry.
Can you hear me now?
Yep. I can hear you. Okay. Sorry. So reiterating, my question was, no, yeah, you're fine. So my question was, how do you think like the average American like political person engages with politics? Do you think it's healthy, like good or bad? And then do you think it can be changed? I guess is kind of like a general.
Yeah. So I think it's bad, right? I mean, it's like we have this whole. I think for a lot of people thought there was this problem that we have like half the country that doesn't vote at all is disengaged. And that is a problem. But then if you look at the people who are engaged, like the people who follow the news, and you look at how they're spending their time, this is sort of the wake-up call for me. It's like you look at all the ways people are spending their time on politics, the people who are spending their time on politics, and it's like kind of a joke. I mean, they're doing it like sports fandom. They are paying attention to stuff that's really not that relevant to them. Like they're paying attention to important stuff far away. And they're not paying attention to like the down and dirty what's going on in their community. They're learning like totally the wrong skill set about politics. Actually, we don't know about politics. I kind of think like if the typical person who follows a lot of political news, like they don't know how power flows in their own state or city. And I think like the intuition you had maybe a few years ago about business engagement. I think that's really common view. And part is because people are like, I don't know how anything happens. Like, I just don't know how anything happens. And I don't know what role I could possibly play in it because it's far away. But then I think, so the book's about this diagnosis of hobbyism and then why it's actually bad, right? So it's not just like a waste of time. Like we are doing something like actually bad for democracy. And then these alternatives. And I think that, when you get into the real game of politics of trying to make a change, like a lot of people now have gotten engaged on issues of policing or have gotten involved in issues on housing. And it's like, it's not it's not a secret about how all that works. It's just hard. And I think that there is something really nerve-wracking about so many people spending time on politics, but not in productive ways. Like if you're trying to do it in productive ways, you'd be like, come on, bring that energy over here.
Yeah. Yeah, I was gonna say I was even gonna correct you when you said it's not a secret. It's just hard. It's not even that it's hard. It's just that all the energy goes to the wrong place. Because if people could channel half the fervor that they have on Twitter into like walking down the street and doing something to reach out to their local government, it feels like so much more could happen. I feel like things would change so much more dramatically than they are right now. You know, you bring up stuff like housing and police, which have been hot topics, especially police. You know, and it's like none of this is going to come from the federal level. Like none of that is changing, maybe very little or whatever, but like for the most part, like, you know, when you talk about like your commissioner of police, this comes from the mayor, right? Like these are, you have to be invested in your local scene to do anything about this. And, you know, crying about who the president is or, you know, who owns the Senate or the House isn't necessarily going to change any of these things. Yeah.
Yeah. And, you know, one thing that happens when you get involved at the local level is like you all of a sudden, like, I think there's like a sense in which you don't even know where you stand in terms of like partisanship or ideology anymore, because everyone, like it's like a bizarro world, right? So like I work a lot on issues of policing where I live, which is like an all Democratic town. Mm-hmm. But you know, there are people who are like, we're the progressives, and that means we like do whatever the police unions think because like unions are Democrat. And then there's other people who are like, no, like we're progressives because like the police union's doing something bad. And all of a sudden, like the normal Democratic versus Republican kind of politics just doesn't make sense anymore. And that's both kind of refreshing, but it's also a little scary because, you know, one of the reasons that people, I think, have a hard time plugging into local or state politics is that, you know, just like real people. It's like your neighbors. You know, it's like your neighbor who really likes the police union, if you are on the other side of the issue, is not a bad person. They just, you know, have a real different view about policing than you have. And so, like, the only alternatives are getting that person on your side or getting more people to the polls than he gets. And both those things are kind of refreshing because, you know, in a lot of these local elections, I don't know what it's like in Omaha, but, you know, a lot of local elections, we have 15% turnout, stuff like that. So it's not impossible to get more people to the polls. Mm-hmm. It's not like...
Something that I would say that is crazy to me is when we were door knocking in Georgia, like everybody knew about this election coming up, obviously, because there's like, if you turn on a TV in Atlanta, you were getting 15 ads back to back to back about Purdue, Ossoff, Warnock, like you're seeing all of it, and everybody knew the election was coming up. A lot of people already voted on mail-in. I think, and I still have to talk to some of my canvassers, but for most of the people that we knocked on doors at for Omaha, they didn't even know there was an upcoming election. And it's so funny because you ask people like, and it's so crazy to me because people have such an interest in the national level politics, even though they live at a local level. Nobody lives in the United States, right? We live in cities in the United States. We live in neighborhoods. We live in local areas, right? But when you ask people, like, when we knock on a door and we say, like, is there anything in Omaha you'd want to see changed? Because ideally what we're expecting is like, oh, like, here's a policy that I'd be interested in. Very few people actually have an answer to that. Nobody really says like, oh yeah, like I think that my city schools could be ran better. Or I think that this could be ran better, you know? But it feels like so many more people have an opinion on something like, you know, Benghazi or Syria or, you know, something more exotic or sexy or international. But when it comes to their own city, they just, you know, don't really seem to have as much of an interest, which is crazy to me.
Yeah, you know, actually, I tend to think right now we're at a point where we've actually, it's been rare that foreign affairs is so unimportant to most people than it is right now. Mm-hmm. Most people on the left will say like the environment, race relations. On the right, they'll say maybe the economy, capitalism, whatever. And all of those are not only national issues, but they're quite local, which is what you mentioned before. I mean, you know, the race stuff that's schools and police. Those are the big issues. Those are all local. You know, in the environment, it's housing and transit and all that stuff. And not only is it local, but it's actually like, you know, if you know, you have listeners here in Germany, like they're also dealing with unaffordable housing and like they're dealing with the same stuff at the local level. So, you know, I think there are like all these local manifestations of politics, but there's also stuff just like, you know, as I talk about in my book, like, you know, there's a lot of more connection between what we think of as like community service and politics at the local level that we just don't see at the national level. Like, you know, at the national level, we don't think about malnourished kids the way you can think about it in a school district or like, you know, young parents who can't afford diapers. Like that stuff is going on in Omaha, right? And here in Boston. And when you think about national politics, you're saying to yourself, like, that's beneath me. But that's a bummer.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, it just, yeah, I guess maybe because all of our news is so, I guess, kind of globalized, like everything is so interconnected. It feels so much more important to be involved in like a Kavanaugh hearing, or to find out what AOC tweeted about, or who Biden's new cabinet secretary or like a pick is, than anything going on in your local scene, which is unfortunate. What this kind of like leads to the next kind of question. What if you're like a normal person, I guess, and you have an actual interest in like political power, so like securing some level of political power that can make a measurable impact in your community? What actions can you take to change people around you, or what can you do? I guess personally, if you want to see that kind of change, I guess what would you recommend for people? Is there like a killer like 3-step plan to get you and your friends like politically active? Like how does that work?
Yeah, I mean, well, the number one thing is, and this is why it's sometimes hard to go from like online community to offline community, is that all the power offline is highly localized. And it's like, how many people in your neighborhood can you bring to a thing, right? And if not your neighborhood, then your city, and if not your city, then your state. But I think we all know this, but like getting we'll just keep on the policing for a second, because it's really interesting, right? It's like, we basically, Black Lives Matter started really online, and, it did generate a lot of in-person protests and all that. But like the thing that is going to sustain that is just like really hard work in municipalities being like, here's how we're gonna change our police force. So we are going, body cameras, public accountability, whatever. And to do any of that work, you need sustained involvement of a few people in a community. So, when I think about my own political work in my like volunteer time, I think a lot about, okay, I can spend time on some like commission doing something, but like, how many friends do I have that I can bring with me when there's like that public meeting? How many like community leaders, like religious leaders, business leaders. And, business leaders doesn't mean like some billionaire. It just means like, it could be like the guy who owns the game shop or whatever, just like how many people who like, how are we going to be taken seriously? And so I think that always thinking about, and when I talk about the organizers that I kind of follow and really admire, they're all like counting people. I mean, it's like they're not thinking about like how many facts do they know, and that's sort of like how we think about politics online. How many facts do I know about what's the latest hearing? They're like, how many people can I get to do this thing, right? And so, like what that requires is essentially, it doesn't necessarily require building offline community, but it does require building localized community. And it's really hard to get anything done without that.
Mm-hmm. So something that is frustrating for me is that I hear the message that you're saying, and a lot of people will say similar things like get involved, get involved, get involved. It seems like one of the most difficult things, though, is how. Where do you start? I know my answer, but that's because I already have a huge following, so I can mobilize people pretty uniquely. But if you're just a person that, you're in your house and you might not even know your neighbors, you don't have like a huge, neighborhood bond with your community. How can a person like that start to get involved on some level if they want to see a change? Maybe something as silly as getting a stoplight removed, or getting a road fixed, or getting, what's like step one for somebody like this?
Yeah, so I once brought my students to the zoning board hearing. And this is in New York. I'm not from New York, but I was visiting and I was doing this like civic training. And I brought these kids to a zoning board hearing, and it turned out there was this woman there who was by herself, and like every week on Tuesday night or whenever they have their zoning board meeting, she shows up. This is her like Tuesday night thing. And over time, she has learned like every rule there is to know about zoning. And she is basically like the thorn in the side of the developers. That's her thing. Like her politics are different than mine. Like, she probably she's kind of like, I think like anti-development. Okay. Sure. But she's the only one there that does that. Right. So there's a zoning board meeting and there's some like thing for a new development. And she sat there and she just learned by sitting there the rules, and she can gum up the process. She has an insane amount of power as one person by herself with no friends. And the only, I mean, not that she has no friends, but she doesn't bring them along.
Yeah.
And the only thing that gave her this power is like once a week, instead of watching Netflix, she went to this meeting. Like that is it. And it's sort of like, there's great opportunity in American politics at the local level, because in many communities, if you get involved, you're the only one. Like you can have a huge amount of influence even without the organization if you just show up. And I've seen this too. I mean, a lot of our local towns and cities are basically run by volunteers. And most of those volunteers are like retirees who have time. And, I feel like I'm still on the younger side and of the age demographic, and I disagree with a lot of these issues like housing and policing, and they're not divisions of Democrats versus Republicans. They're basically like old versus young, homeowners versus renters.
Yeah.
And that demographic that's retired and has time has a lot of power at the local level. But the good news is it's easy to counteract that just by like again, once a week, not watching Netflix.
Here, this is a hard one. And I'm cheating a little too, because it'll help me in my Omaha project. How do you get people to vote? How do you get people to actually what do you know of any effective strategies where this group of people did this thing and it increased turnout by 120% or 200% in some particular area? Because it seems like one of the big problems with so many local areas is the civic engagement, as you pointed out earlier, can be almost single digits sometimes. It's very, 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 very low, especially when it comes to primaries.
Yeah. So people don't know who to vote for, right? Like they don't, it's like as soon as you go away from national politics and they don't have a Democrat versus Republican, or even just any kind of good versus evil frame, everyone kind of panics. I don't know, I don't know how to weigh in here. I don't want to mess up with my ballot. I should just defer to people who know what they're talking about. And so a lot of people are kind of blank slates, right? And so, I often talk about, I talk to Democratic groups more than Republican groups, or liberals more than conservatives. And I think that one thing that liberals misunderstand about conservatives, particularly about religious conservatives, is how useful a religious network is, right? It's like you have a church. You don't need a pastor to tell people who to vote. But in a church, you have 100 or 200 people who know each other. So if one of those people, just one of those people, sends an email saying, "Hey, everyone, there's a local election come up, and and our guy is Smith," and because they trust that person and respect that person, they vote for that person. And I have to say, I'm in a religious community. I do that myself, and so I know that people walk into the voting booth with my slate for local offices. And it's not because they're automatons or idiots. It's because they're, they have another job, and my job is politics. And so they defer to me. And just like I would defer to them if I don't know, my kid bruised his knee and they're a doctor or something like that. So what I would say is it is so hard to counteract that. If you imagine, so the kind of stuff that we often see, particularly on the Democratic side, that's championed is the canvassing, the door knocking, the phone banking. And that stuff is useful, and it's scientifically proven to work. We do experiments. We find out, you do these things as a 1 percentage point increase in turnout, and you do it to $1,000 door. You start to make a difference. But it's all kind of a shitty Band-Aid for the alternative, which is knowing people, right? Anytime you're talking to strangers, you're worse off than the person who's talking to people they know. And so a lot of what's happened over time as canvassing has gotten more sophisticated is it tries to mimic more and more talking to someone we go into deep canvassing. We try to have intense conversations, personal, empathetic conversations with people. All that stuff is great. But I think it's really important to not lose sight of the fact that that is all triage for the absence of personal ties. Yeah. And so being in a real, it doesn't have to be a religious community. If you know people because you go to the same bar every week or whatever it is, you have a leg up in your neck of the woods. It's just 5 people.
Yeah, I was gonna say, my history is really bad, so I only pick up tidbits every now and then. But it feels like American politics used to be way more localized, and it feels like the disappearing of two big institutions. One are kind of like the church. Personally, I'm very atheist, but it seems like the church played a really important role in like having communities of people together that were interacting, that were doing service, that were knowing each other, that were forming relationships. And then it seemed like unions used to play bigger roles in communities as well. And as these two things have kind of, or from my perspective, have largely subsided from American culture, nothing has really stepped in to fill that vacuum. Like on a personal level, like I'm happy to see people become more secular, but I think it's really sad that you kind of completely lose that community orientation. Like you've just ceded all of that ground to religious institutions, and nothing like kind of came up to replace that, which seems really damaging.
Yeah, for sure that happened with unions, particularly like private sector unions have been decimated, and public sector unions. I think that Democrats are only beginning to come to grips with how distinct those union preferences are from their own. When it comes to things like school choice or policing, it's not like
Or climate change sometimes.
or climate change. It's not like liberals are always on the same page with unions, but the public sector unions, but they're in a coalition basically. The churches have obviously declined across the board, but way more on the left than the right. I mean, it's still the case that we still have a huge percentage of the public that identifies as Christian conservative, that attends church. It's just that became kind of really correlated with politics. And you're right. I mean, it's hard to. I don't want to be. I'm not trying to to get anyone to be religious if they want to be, but a lot of what happens in religious community is just like someone, their kid gets sick and you bring them a meal, they have, things like that, I think actually there have been some groups on the left since Trump, the kind of, resistance groups that have popped up and have built some of that community. So I think there is a chance for political groups to do that. But for the most part, you're right. I don't think it's been replaced by anything that quite matches it.
Yeah, I mean, like you become, or at least for me, I imagine a lot of atheists become atheists because of the theological part. But then, like, there's so much value around, because I grew up very Catholic, and there's so much value around the whole church infrastructure that is just totally gone. And even if you do nothing, even if you never get out of your house, you don't work a job or whatever, at the very least on Saturday or Sunday, you're guaranteed some interaction and some face-to-face time with other human beings where there's some level of socialization and everything. And especially for young people, I don't think anything like that exists, outside of like school or something. Yeah.
Well, the scary thing is that I think that, it's the thing that religion does is that it provides a mission that is the reason why people come together. And politics can also provide that. Here's the mission. We have a mission of getting empowering our values, and it can generate that community. But for the most part, it doesn't. In the opening passages of the book, I talk about the Ku Klux Klan going in North Carolina in 2018, like not ancient history, and running an opioid clinic. Going around being, you have an addiction, it's not your fault, we're here to help you. And, what that is that is community building and community service with, a horrible purpose. But I put that in the opening passage of the book because I want people to be like, oh man, that's how they're recruiting people. They're looking people in the eye and helping them. And man, if they're the only political entity that's doing that, we're in deep trouble. But there's no reason a local political party, a club, can't do that. And I think it does have the combination that religion has of mission, right, with social service. It's not like you're just delivering meals or helping people for its own sake. It's because you actually are trying to build these human connections that you're going to leverage for getting power for the things you care about in politics.
Yeah, we've had arguments related to this in the past where the Ku Klux Klan was not just, we get together, we talk about how much we hate black people. There was a whole bunch of other services related to the community that they kind of provided where depending on what town you lived in, you almost kind of had to be in the Ku Klux Klan because it was just, that was the community that everybody was a part of. And then even when it comes to the mob in New York and stuff, they weren't just doing criminal enterprises too. A lot of them, I think in New York, I think they were really deep in the, in the trash sector in terms of like doing a lot of this stuff. They were like really embedded in a lot of these communities for services they offered, which seemed to be pretty important, I guess, in having these things, I guess, more
Yeah,
established. Yeah.
it's no secret. We talk about like some of the groups like, Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas. These groups like have health clinics and education clinics, and it's like you don't just win support with ideology. Most people don't care about ideology.
Mm-hmm.
You win support by like doing good deeds, and then you can leverage that.
Mm-hmm. What do you think? If you're like an E-celeb, or you're one of these people, it sounds like based on your Twitter comments earlier that you're somewhat aware of how absolutely cancerous the online political scene is. If you have a lot of influence in these areas, what do you think are some of the most productive ways that you can kind of point people towards? Like, I want to exercise real political power. This is what I'm going to tell my audience to do. Like, do you have any suggestions or ideas in terms of that? Yeah.
No, I mean, I think that, the fact that you've gone people offline and into canvassing is great. I mean, I think that the main thing, and it sounds small, I think, but I think it's really important, is to change the culture around how we talk about politics. Like, I'm a political science professor. I study U.S. elections, but I don't let anyone come talk to me and ask me like what I think about Nate Silver's polling or something like that. Like, I just don't have conversations like that anymore. It kind of like is a little uncomfortable at dinner table. I'm not an E-celebrity, but someone comes to my house for dinner and be like, "What do you think of the polling average?" Like, give me a break. Like, tell me what we're doing in the community. Mm-hmm. And I think that setting the tone of like highlighting real stuff that's happening at the local level, drawing attention to that news when that news is made, but also just not playing into the kind of mindless national stuff. It's like the national stuff that's like, oh, did you see like this person's reaction to that person's like, tweet? Like, stop. We have so much important stuff to do. And I also think like this part is really hard. Online especially, like we're really not practicing good politics because we're always trying to score points and never trying to be empathetic. Mm-hmm. And I have a hard time with this. Like, I'm not, because I'm not a saint. I'm not as good as this as I wish I was. When you talk about something like policing, right? And like, we want the police to change, to maybe not have armed officers in the schools anymore. And, that might be a good principle, and I might really agree with that. But there is a person on the other side of that who has a job, who is that's their job, to be in the schools in that. And a lot of the people in the community, the way they perceive the issue is like, I'm friends with that person. That person, I care about that person. And so they don't think about it in terms of like, get the police out of the schools. They're thinking in terms of like, I don't want my friend to get fired. And so I would say that like, it's really hard because we come to this with like pretty strong values, most of us, to then be really empathetic to that situation so that we can make progress on it. So it's not just like digging in your heels. It's certainly not something I've mastered, but every time I'm online and like tweet something snarky because I can't help myself, I just think like, I know I'm doing this wrong. We can't afford to like burn bridges to people who we're just not taking them seriously. And it's like, most people don't come at politics from, I think, with like ill intent. I just think that like getting away from the point scoring is hard, but necessary.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's incredibly positive to engage in that behavior when it comes to like sports, because it's fun and because it doesn't matter, and because that's like half the enjoyment of demoralizing and defeating like some enemy sports team, depending on what you're playing or what you're more likely, I guess, what you're watching. But the inability to understand each other's sides on political issues is something that really bothers me. And I guess you probably agree that it's gotten more and more radical as time has gone on. I know there was a lot of in-party kind of fighting and talking over, going about the police stuff, like defund the police, to where you have to be so incredibly careful in those conversations because, on one end, you're either like pro minority murdering fascist dogs, or you're pro defund the police. And then on the other end, you're either for total lawless mayhem or, law and order. There's like no in between on any side. And it feels so hard to do to come, like just coming to the middle on something and forging some sort of agreement between two parties, that in and of itself is seen almost as horrible on both ends at this point, right? Biden is, admittedly, some of my takes that I give you might be very online because it is where I live most of my life, but it seems like Biden gets so much criticism for anything that comes off as even remotely, agreement forging between the left and the right, when it's like kind of a necessary part of government. And then same thing, the radical divides, the extremism on both sides, and the inability to see anybody's point of perspective on anything is so infuriating.
Yeah, and it's sort of like, it's one thing when that happens at like the national level, when it is kind of these like political celebrities, Ted Cruz or whatever who's doing it. But if you take that approach to state and local politics, when the people are like, they're not Ted Cruz or they're not AOC, but like you still bring that ammunition, like that's never going to work. And I have to say one more thing, because I feel like your audience is probably on the younger side. Is that right?
Compared to what? Probably.
I don't know. Compared to the libraries I often give book talks to.
Yeah, probably younger. Yeah. Okay.
Well, look, I was going to say, like, I think about this with my students all the time who are, undergrads, and they're, I think it's particularly hard to think about politics the way that I kind of champion it when you're 19, 20, 21, because, for one thing, like, you have a much more rooted online experience than anyone before you. But another reason is like, people are getting married and having kids not till they're like 30, 35. So there's this long period and no one can afford to live anywhere. So you're like renting and moving every 18 months and you're not settled down. And so I think, you were asking before, like, what's like the one thing you're supposed to do? Well, like the thing I'm saying is like get involved in local community. I think that's really a hard sell for people who are like, I don't even know where I live. I don't know where I'm going to live in 5 months. And the only response I have to that is like, we just can't afford for people to wait until they're 35 to start getting involved in politics for a couple reasons, right? One is like, that's a long time if you're 20, but more than that, it's like, then you're going to, you have kids or whatever, you're going to be super busy until you're the retiree who's the, conservative status quo person. So the thing to do is like, not worry about being only in a community for a little while. You still got to invest. Like, it's still worth it to help a community organization, even if you're going to live in one place for only a year, because A, like, you're going to help them, and B, you're going to like learn skills and relationships. So I feel like it's always a bummer when you talk to like a 22-year-old who's about to, I think in your 20s, people move something like on average every 18 months. It's like, what are you supposed to do? And so that's why people like take to the online national stuff, because at least they find common ground with all their friends on Ted Cruz. But, I think the alternative is these are the years where you can practice being a real citizen.
Yeah. Something that I think is really unfortunate is politics seems to be, it's not like a primary thing we do. It seems to be downstream from so many other parts of our lives. And it feels like those parts of our lives have changed so much that make good political engagement almost impossible. So like earlier, we kind of talked about like the ceding so much ground with churches kind of disappearing or not being as popular on the left, or with unions kind of, like fading away. You bring up the idea of moving now. I remember that when I grew up, because I grew up in Omaha, Nebraska, like you were considered basically a loser if you stayed there. And I know it's similar in a lot of the Midwest. Like if you're not moving to the coast, you failed in life, basically. That nobody wants to stay in a little hometown that you live in. And I can't imagine how it feels growing up on a coastal city where, like 50% of the people in that or more are from other states, other cities, or other countries even. I think I looked this up. I want to say in LA, I think like 40% of the population is like foreign born. Not that I'm about to give a crazy anti-immigration take or anything like that, but just more the idea that I can understand why people's investments in their communities are going to be so different than they might have, a long time ago when people weren't moving. Like I need to get vested in Amazon, then I need to get vested in Google, then I need to get my 3-year investment in this, and then I need to move around and move all these and do all these jobs. It feels like so much of our lives have changed that make that local engagement with politics really anti-intuitive. Whereas before maybe it kind of naturally happened. Like if you go to church every Sunday, if you see the same people, if your dad's going to the union meetings and you hang out with the same guys, you're going to have some investment in the locals, and you have to, like, it'll just happen naturally, It seems like all of that is kind of gone, and now you have to make a very concentrated effort to get involved in a meaningful way in the political scene. In a way, sometimes it's detrimental to the rest of your life, because, like the rest of your friends can be having fun, talking about how evil, did you see Ted Cruz is going to Cancun? AOC roasted him on that and blah, blah, blah. And like, that's what everybody's talking about. And you're like, hey guys, there's like a city council meeting about like, funding our roads, or whether or not, we're going to change property taxes for the school, and nobody even knows about it, let alone cares about it.
Yeah, that's right. But the weird thing about it is, it's like I remember, I think it was during the Iowa caucuses, where I think something like went wrong with their like tallying system, and you saw all these people on Twitter like getting like deep into the Iowa Democratic Party's like tech. It's like they're willing to go deep into local politics, just not their own, and only if it's like in some nationalized. People are learning all about like water mains in Texas right now. They're learning about how many people need to boil their water. They're learning stuff like this. And it's like, okay, you want to be part of the national conversation, but, there is actually stuff to do in Omaha. And
I was going to say, on the caucusing especially, that's so funny because people got so mad about the caucus stuff. And my takeaway from that is caucuses are horrible. We should never be using caucuses. If we take away anything from this, I don't know, or maybe you feel differently. I don't know why anybody would ever use a caucus over a primary. It just seems so much better to go with a primary system. And it feels like a lot of people learn that for the first time in 2020 especially. Jeez.
But yeah, I mean, like, I guess the thing about it in local politics is you get to feel like you're building something. You get to feel like there is going to be a vote on this thing that I've been working on, and if the vote goes my way, like the 5 city councilors or whatever, like I've changed something, and so I think you have to be able to. There's a bit of there's like, I think a little bit about like ego and introvert and extrovert. Like all the best organizers I ever met are like, oh, I'm introverted. Like I don't want to be at the center of things, but I want to like move people along. Okay, I'm not a good organizer because I'm more of an extrovert. But there's also like a bit of an ego I noticed that comes along that's a positive thing, which is like, if I'm not working on these issues of policing or housing in my community, like someone a lot worse than me is. You have to feel like a little bit like, I am needed here because like this thing is not going to go well without me. And I think like, you don't need to be a influencer or a, teacher. You can be anyone and feel that way. And feel like you can make something happen, which you obviously cannot do in national politics, but you really can do in local politics. And you feel like I can do it better than the next person who's there, because the next person who's there is actually like not someone who shares my values that much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. The story that I always give that kind of blew my mind, I think this was 2 or 3 years ago, there was like there's a really annoying stoplight outside my house, and it was finally marked for deletion. They hooded it like it was going to the gallows. I was so excited for it. And I remember like a week after they put the signs up that the light was getting deleted and everything, that some little old lady came knocking on my door, and she had this petition in her hand to save the stoplight. And I couldn't imagine how much this lady was just wasting her time, because I don't know why anybody would think that they could make, who cares, whatever. And I ignored it. I was like, I'm good. I don't like that stuff anyway. That's funny that you think you can change it or whatever. And then a week later, because I walked my son to and from school, I came by and all the signs were removed and the hoods were gone, and that damn light is still there because she walked around and she got the signatures that she needed, and they must have went through a city council meeting. They saved the stoplight. I couldn't believe it. But I can't imagine though how awesome that feels for those people, that there was like, because especially when I say a kid, I'm not really a kid, I'm 32. When you're whatever age I am, stuff like in the real world seems kind of immutable. Like that stuff isn't supposed to change. You're not really supposed to be able to do something to change it, but you can. And I'm sure, you talk a little bit about the ego thing. I'm sure that they felt a great deal of pride that they were able to change course for what the city was doing and have like a measurable, like there was a stoplight, it was going to be a stop sign, and we've changed it. That seeing that type of real world change has got to feel so much better than I guess I don't want to discourage people from it, but being like one drop in the bucket for a huger national thing, to even try to find out our impact in Georgia when we, I say we knock 20,000 doors, requires a ton of data scrubbing. How did our county perform, not just relative to the general election, but relative to the relativity of other counties in the general election to see if we had a measurable impact. Like, it's so much harder to see the impact you have on that huge of a level. Whereas like on a local level, yeah, you can literally see it right there.
Yeah, there's also something about, there is something, not to bring us back to religious terms, but when you're talking to another voter, I'm sure if you've been out canvassing, you might have had this experience. It's like you have this chance, is really weird but profound chance to like change someone's life. Like, you might be encountering someone at the door. Like, usually it's a bummer and awkward and like the whole thing is weird, like you're talking to a stranger, but every once in a while you have a conversation with someone on the phone or on the door who like you connect with, and like you might have like made this lasting impact on their life. And there is like this sense in which you talk to people who are like missionaries or whatever, and they're like, they'll spend a whole day for the chance at bat. They'll spend the whole day or a year, just a chance to like change someone's life forever. And, we don't need the religious terms. Like, there's a lot at stake in politics, and like we actually give ourselves that chance if we're canvassing. So yeah, it's true. You're right. If you're fighting the stop signs, it's easier to measure if you succeed or fail than if you're knocking on doors when 1,000 or 1,000,000 other people are also doing it. But I definitely wouldn't diminish that thing that's happening during canvassing, which like it is a drop in the bucket, but at the same time, it's like I might have just doubled my vote and changed someone's life.
Yeah, for sure. Especially in the smaller cities where these primaries are decided sometimes by hundreds of votes. Like doing work over a day with multiple people over multiple days, that definitely adds up. If you knock on 100 doors in a day, which is easily possible, especially with a friend, and you've got 10 people doing that over the course of a month, it adds up. And in some of these smaller elections, one of the examples in your book actually was when the college campus kids formed their little group and then they showed up to take a new vote, I think it was either going to be the head of that little region or whatever, and they had more people show up than the old guard. Yeah, I think that type of stuff is really cool. I'm trying to think of what else. Is there anything else you want to chat about, or anything else you? You said you teach political science. I've brought on, now, not to make any of your students feel bad, I've brought on multiple political science graduates onto the stream. Okay, I'm a music school dropout because I had to work too much and I had to quit school. And I've asked them several times, what do you actually study in political science? What does that mean? And none of them have actually given me an answer, even people that are graduated. So I'm curious, what do you actually teach? What do you do for teaching? Yeah.
Yeah, so I teach like a few kinds of class. So I teach a class on U.S. elections. So we get into things like voting rights. Like, what is what's the Constitution say? How do we pass this law called the Voting Rights Act? And, what do states have to do to comply with it? And how do we know whether the states are doing it right? We talk about things like money in politics, right? The Supreme Court in 2008, I guess, passed it, did Citizens United, a really controversial ruling. And, we talk about like, what is that nature of that ruling? And is it good? Is it bad? What are the alternative views of it? And we do a lot of data analysis, like, interesting questions like why are women so underrepresented in office? There's like this amazing, just like a little study, but I just love it. It's like, here's like this amazing thing in state legislatures. If you, the districts that are closest to the state capital are more likely to have women representatives.
Wait, say that again. The people that are closest to the state capital are the most likely to win as representatives?
The districts that are closest to the state capital are more likely to have women representatives. Okay. That is, women who want to run for office in part when the commuting time is shorter. And the men don't care about the commuting time.
Interesting. Okay.
You got me? It's interesting because, what does that mean? It means like, basically like men don't mind, being away from their families a lot. And women are much more sensitive to that issue. you get data and you you see things like that. I also teach a class on technology and politics. We talk about antitrust and Amazon, and we talk about surveillance, GPS tracking, all of those stuff. It's a lot of law and then social science, data analysis.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Okay. That was kind of an acceptable answer. All right. If you graduate with a degree of poli sci, what do you feel like you've learned? Are you like, I know the U.S. government, and this is kind of a reductive question. I'm half me, I guess, but it's always so interesting because the term political science, it kind of sounds like when somebody says like, what do you do for work? Like, I'm a consultant. It's like, what does that mean? I guess it just depends on what classes you take particularly.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's a lot of, some people who do what I do have careers in polling, and that's like their thing. They're basically survey researchers. When I get brought into court cases, like I went to testify in Kansas a year ago, 2 years ago, and it was like, how many non-citizens are voting in Kansas? And how do you know? And so, you figure out like, okay, well, do you have a list of non-citizens? Can I match that list to a list of voters? How many non-citizens are voting? Or right at when there was like a Cambridge Analytica Facebook scandal. Do you remember that?
Yes.
So I went to the Republicans on the Senate in the United States Senate asked me to testify about whether the Cambridge Analytica targeting was likely to be effective or not. So, then I do like an analysis about ad targeting. And so for me, it's pretty quantitative. It's like, what is the effect of X on Y? Other people study, like theories of jurisprudence. It's interesting. Like a lot of people in my class, they'll have a position on like Citizens United, and it's mostly liberal students. So they'll mostly be like, "That's bad," whatever. And then, you read the case and you're like, I don't know. There's like.
I had the same really uncomfortable moment where I was dead set against super PACs. I hated them. It was obviously the dumbest ruling of all time. It was so corrupt. And then I had a conservative come on my stream and hardcore challenge me about Citizens United. And I actually came away from that conversation. I couldn't admit it at the time because my ego is huge. But in the weeks of introspection that followed, I completely 180'd on it, where it's like, Citizens United is really hard. Like, I don't actually know if I could take the honor of that ruling. Like, if I wanted to advertise, something about climate change 60 days before an election, like, I don't know. I think I should have the right to do that, even if it is against candidate. Like, it's one of the most, I don't know if I'd say misunderstood cases, but people seem to have a really strong position against it when I feel like it's not as easy as some people try to make it sound like.
Yeah, same thing with gerrymandering. I mean, Democrats seem to have this like anti-gerrymandering position. And then, again, you read the court cases, you read what the thought process is of the conservatives. And then if you're a Democrat, your position really should be like, wow, Democrats should just gerrymander like hell. Like they should just go to town with gerrymandering. But anyway, the issues are
Oh, wait, hold on. I gotta ask you more about that because I'm super curious. My understanding is people's problems with gerrymandering has always been that like the districts don't, the way that a district is drawn, it doesn't really represent any true district. Like it's very like, so we've all seen like if you Google like top 10 most gerrymandered districts, you've got like the most hand carved things for the optimal political stuff. Are you saying that you defend like that type of gerrymandering or just the concept of drawing districts in general?
Well, I mean, the thing about it, like, you take an analogous situation. So there was this court case in the 60s. In the 60s, there was like what was called malapportionment, which means like in California, like LA County had 400 times less representation in state legislators than rural counties. And you often had this like rural-urban split. And in 1962, the Supreme Court's like, you can't do that anymore. All the districts have to be the same size. And the reason the Supreme Court was able to make such a decisive action on that, and all the states just listened to it, right? So now every district has to be exactly the same size, is because it's so easy to comply. It's obvious what the standard is. If you go to the court and be like, wow, this district has 2 times more people in this district, the court's like, you can't do that, change it. With gerrymandering, we actually have basically no common view about what that standard should be. So like a district that is really narrow here and has a bulge here, that is like a town with a highway and a town. Mm-hmm. And like those people might feel like they're in the same community. I mean, highways do like connect people across communities. You look at the shape of districts, like where I live in Massachusetts, anywhere near water, you have all these weird shaped districts because coastlines are weird. But the main thing is like, we have no way of looking at a map and saying, where a judge who's not a technical expert can say this district looks, decisively too gerrymandered or not gerrymandered enough. It's totally unlike the thing about like the same number of people per district, because like we just don't have a common, easy enough standard.
Do you think it's more advantageous for the political process that like independent commissions set it up, or do you think that state legislatures should be in charge of figuring out how districts should be drawn? I'm just kind of curious.
Well, there's some research that says that if you do it independently without any like partisan thought, you hurt Democrats. And the reason you hurt Democrats is because Democrats are really highly concentrated in cities and Republicans are spread out. It's not like Republicans are concentrated in suburbs and rural areas. Republicans make up like, a small majority in most of the country. And in the cities, they make up a tiny minority. So if you just use strictly nonpartisan standards, one effect of that could be that you just have these very packed Democratic districts in cities where, the Democratic districts are 90% Democratic. Meanwhile, the Republican ones are 55% Republican. And so the Republicans just get a huge advantage. So there is some value in actually thinking about partisanship when you're drawing the districts. And there's a risk that the independent commissions don't do that enough. So, it kind of just depends on how they do it.
Gotcha. Here's a question. How long have you been teaching?
I don't know, 9 years, some of that.
9 years? Okay. Over the course of the last 9 years, I guess, so much of what's talked about online especially is the further radicalization of college students. And then, this comes out in different ways, whether it's, cancel culture or people having, views one way or not. Has your job as a teacher, do you feel like your engagement with students has changed significantly over the past decade, or do you think it's more or less been the same? Do you feel like you get, so for instance, when we just talked about Citizens United, do you feel like 9 years ago you could have presented that and the class would have been cool with it, or they would have engaged with it, whereas now you might get a more visceral response of you're wrong, professor? Or I'm curious how you feel that way, just as a personal.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I would say that my own my own politics are kind of all over the place. So I'm on the, I generally identify on the Democratic side, but I sometimes identify as conservative. I have a lot of positions, including Citizens United, where I told the students, I always tell the students this, when I read that, that opinion the day it came out, and I read it, I was like, yeah, this is definitely right. It's the conservative decision is right. And then I was kind of shocked when it became a politicized thing, because I thought, this is not an obvious good versus evil kind of situation here, like you just said. So I usually have I guess a diversity of views. I think I've become, I would say when it comes to issues like race, gender, I think, students expect faculty to come with that with a very, very high level of sensitivity. And one thing that's hard is that, if you're teaching a class on elections like I teach, you might have a couple classes on the Voting Rights Act, or a couple classes about, again, I did this lecture on the gendered pipeline to running for office. And, but I'm not an expert in gender and politics. I'm not an expert in race and politics. And so I think that I do feel when it comes to issues that I know students are going to be quite sensitive about, I probably am more cautious about how I present the work, and just, I'll write out my lecture notes a little, a little more carefully, because, the issues are sensitive. And that probably has changed a bit over time. Yeah. But it doesn't affect, in terms of the ideology, I think the students think of me as, sort of a centrist. So I wonder whether I'm in a situation where I'm in a school where the students are overwhelmingly liberal. I'm probably on the more moderate side of the faculty, but there are people at the school who are, more conservative or more liberal. And then there's of course a lot of faculty who are teaching at schools where the students are much more polarized.
Yeah, something that kind of along that line, something that really bothers me is when the partisanship becomes so extreme and the ideology becomes so extreme that it precludes you from seeing actually politically effective strategy. Do you know who David Shor is?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I remember that he gave some analysis related to riots, I guess, and the impact of, the MLK riots and the impact of the depressed voter turnout in those areas and how they went more conservative than not. Even him suggesting that, because people moralize a lot of these statements so much, was like basically tantamount to him being just like a racist hater of BLM and everything. And he got ousted from his job just as a result of making some of those kind of like descriptive analyses. And when I start to see Democrats potentially losing areas, earlier I brought up that a lot of Democrats were very upset about the ACAB stuff, or not the ACAB stuff, I'm sorry, the defund the police stuff, or that some Democrats feel like maybe it's not as healthy to rely on the socialism messaging when you have a lot of people coming from South America and stuff. When I start to see elections maybe being lost or electorability, I don't know if it's a word, being hurt because of kind of like these ideologically rooted positions, that's something that worries me a lot. And I hope that's not a trend. Maybe it's just a one-off in this past election. It's hard to tell what's a one-off versus what will become a trend, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, again, like a lot of that, I think stems from the fact that like we're having nationalized conversations, but they don't have to be. Like, I don't particularly care for a lot of like AOC's politics, but I don't live in her district. Like, it's kind of irrelevant. But if that politics is like the national message for what politics is, like, then that creates problems for coalition partners for that view. But and I think that when people are, I like this week or last week, I made some comment on Twitter, which I shouldn't have made, which was it was sort of a boring comment. The comment was that all these states went to mail voting because of COVID, right? You can vote by mail in a lot of states. And when they went to those mail voting, the story from all the political science research was that this doesn't help Democrats or Republicans. It doesn't help whites or non-whites. It's sort of just like a convenience thing, and we should do it because of COVID. And then, after the 2020 election, it got very politicized, where the Republicans are like, it's fraudulent or whatever. And, they're really wrong about that. They haven't shown any evidence about that. But the Democrats have responded by saying, well, we need, like, now mail voting is like a litmus test for us. Like, we need to like defend mail voting at all costs. And in every state. And I wrote something that was like, no one should have any stake in this thing. Like, it's convenient. I think it's good. A lot of voters like it. But like, if there's no partisan advantage or advantage of different, racial groups, like, don't care that much about it. Anyway, then of course, like, the messages came in over Twitter. That's like, this is like, an evil thing to say. And, it's like, 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 not everything has to have that high stakes vibe to it. But I understand where people were coming from. They were coming from a place of being like, when you say don't care that much about whether we have mail voting or not, you're basically lending support to folks who are saying the mail voting was fraudulent, and that is bothersome. And I get it. But like, in a way, like, I was in my head having a conversation of like what we should do in Massachusetts, and like, and I wasn't talking about, what we should do everywhere, but you go on Twitter and that's not what happens. You're like in a national conversation, whether you like it or not.
Yeah. This is actually just purely an empirical question because I don't know. My assumption would have been that mail-in voting would help Democrats more than not. Is that not the case? Has that been settled? Or I know obviously in this particular election, Trump heavily discouraged mail-in voting, so that would weigh it maybe in favor of the Democrats. But my understanding is that generally the more people you get to vote, the more people in general you bring out to vote, the more that communities that traditionally don't vote as much would be likely to. And those communities tend to vote left-leaning, so minority communities or younger communities. That would have been my assumption.
Yeah, so it doesn't, for one thing, it doesn't raise participation. Unless it hasn't in the past. There are some exceptions to that, like the kind of mail voting they have in like Washington, Oregon, where everyone only gets a mail ballot. That's been shown to increase turnout. But the kind of mail voting that most states went to was like, you don't need an excuse for an absentee vote, and that doesn't increase turnout at all. In fact, like generally what happens is that this is thing that's used by older people the most, who maybe don't want to go to the polls in person, or they just like, they vote much earlier in the process. There's one that's kind of a funny pattern that, like, if you have a state with early voting or mail voting, you have this, like, you can vote up to, say, 2 or 3 weeks ahead of time by mail or early in person. And the first period of that is mostly all elderly people. They, like, get it over with right away. And so, like, all the young people, if they vote by mail at all, is like they vote at the last possible day of it. But no, it's, mostly been the domain of older people who like it, which is kind of why it was bizarre that the Trump campaign was saying don't use mail voting, because that's, elderly voters are now more a Trump demographic.
Interesting.
But yeah,
that'll be super interesting going forward. I'll believe whatever I read in terms of what the study shows, but my gut feeling is I feel like mail-in voting would help so much for younger people. I don't know if it's just me. I hate driving to polling places. It's just, I hate it. I hate it so much. But the mail-in stuff was actually so easy to do. And I enjoyed the process of mail-in voting a lot because, especially when there's referendums on the ballot, or when because a lot of the ballots you'll get will be like, who do you want to keep for, like, judge of this? Where it's like, I don't know who any of these people are. Being able to, like, look it all up on my computer is actually a really nice experience. And then being able to fill it out. But yeah, I guess it's possible.
Younger people like don't even, use the mail. Like, they'll check their mail.
Yeah, no, that's true too. Yeah, no, you're right. Yeah, that's right. I guess maybe I'm just because I'm more plugged in or whatever, and the mail-in voting seems so easy. Maybe I'm a slightly different use case there than an average younger voter. Okay, so final. I don't want to keep you all night. So final kind of like broad kind of question. I feel like we're in a unique position today where there is a lot of power that moves us away from good political practice. So there are hyper-specific computer algorithms. You mentioned the Cambridge Analytica stuff, right? We have hyper-specific computer algorithms that are trying to keep you glued to a screen for as long as possible. And sometimes the best way to do that is by showing you more and more and more partisan content, because that's what sells the most. So there's like this vested interest in capital and this interest in society at large to keep you glued onto these more extremist politics. Do you ever see us moving back to a more, I don't want to say pragmatic, but at least like realistic view of politics where we're at least in the same universe, where one side isn't talking about, like Hunter Biden tapes and, do we ever have that reality that exists, that common ground that exists anymore? Because it feels to me that like we keep moving in the other direction. I don't know how we get back. What is your view? How do we save American politics, or maybe even worldwide politics? Yeah, what do you think about that?
I mean, I'll tell you what I'm working on is, like, I'm trying to start this thing up in Boston of getting college students to be writing about state and local politics, and so we obviously have this, like, just collapse of local media, but we also have, like I said, we kind of talked about at the very beginning of this conversation. We have a whole generation of people, not just young people, but a whole, like, what the internet has done is, like, we don't even know how, like, a bill becomes a law anymore. Like, we don't know how things at the state and local level happen.
Yeah.
Who's involved? How do business groups get involved? How do citizen groups get involved? How do ballot initiatives work? Like, what if I really care about climate change? Like, what is the thing I can do? Mm-hmm. And I think that part of it is I think there is, like, the algorithmic incentive to be away from that. There's also, I think, there's something very sanitized about national politics, which is that if you keep everyone's eyeballs that focus on national politics, we actually don't have to deal with any of these issues in our community. I picture here, and I'm sure a lot of other places, we had, like, kids in schools before COVID, and their parents and the schools let them, like, march downtown for some, like, international climate change rally. And, they would go downtown, all the kids with their teachers and parents' blessing, and they would, like, protest in favor of, like, the UN climate change thing or whatever. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking to myself, like, you know what? Those parents would not let those kids march to City Hall and ask for the city to do something. They're marching to have UN do something, which is never going to happen.
Sure.
But yeah. They don't want their kids marching to City Hall and saying, hey, like, raise our home prices and taxes and whatever, because to solve climate change, because this is a sense it's sanitized. Like, the more national it is, the more it's, like, never going to happen. I mean, I think I I have a real negative, I have a reverse reaction to like any of these big, Green New Deal, Medicare, for all that stuff, because it feels to me like this like nationalized gimmick that is never going to happen. And I think that a lot of people want it that way because they don't have to then deal with the trade-offs. I think like where I am in this very liberal place of Massachusetts, they send like Elizabeth Warren and Ed Markey, liberal firebrands to the Senate, but they don't want any of that politics locally. Like they want conservative politics locally because they don't want to pay for the expensive stuff. So, yeah.
It's so hard not to cut you off. I 1,000,000,000% agree. The idea behind that, the sanitization thing, it's really easy to push for the most extreme position because one, a lot of the people that do it online aren't really affected one way or another because they're wealthy white suburban kids that live in communities where they're fine no matter what. And then two, if they succeed, it's obviously awesome because they reach for the moon. And if they fail, they can always demonize everybody else around them that's doing the real work, right? So I am a huge fan of universal healthcare. I think it is a crime that we don't have some form of universal healthcare in the United States. I don't think that has to be Medicare for all, though. That could be a public option. That could be better funded exchanges. There are other ways to do that. But the amount of people that will say you hate poor people, you hate healthcare because you do not support the one Medicare for all position. If you don't support that exact position, you don't want anything. It blows my mind. And then even earlier, when you said people don't understand how a bill becomes a law, the amount of people that I see screaming about like why didn't the Democrats why didn't they stop the Supreme Court nomination, why didn't they keep ACB out? It's like, what are they supposed to do? You had a chance for that. You were the Senate election, you lost. There's nothing you can do at that point. I don't know why so much energy seems to be wasted on things that like just literally aren't politically possible, like by the process itself like doesn't bear it. That the sanitized positions, and then another thing that you mentioned, because you mentioned like the Green New Deal. And again, like when it comes to climate change, I agree with Biden. I truly do believe that it is one of the most important issues in our time. But like the all or nothing fantastical bills, not only do they do nothing, I think they're very cowardly positions because it's so easy to sit up there and say we need to radically change all of these things. And it's like, okay, well, what are the actual steps we're going to take to do it? I remember there was a study that we read a while ago, and it was like when you poll people and you find out like, do you support doing something for climate change? It's like 85% of respondents like, yeah, we should. And then when it's like, would you make a $1 a month contribution? You lose 20%. And then when it gets up to like, I think it was like $100 a month, you have like a 15% retention on the people that'd be willing to make just that sacrifice, It really frustrates me.
Here, like, we just sent Ed Markey to the U.S. Senate, who's like the Green New Deal guy. And like, we also have most people in Massachusetts who voted for Ed Markey, like, don't want to raise the gas tax by a penny. I mean, forget,
or don't want to touch property taxes, and they talk about how teachers need more funding, But if you even threaten to even inch it up even 0.5%, people lose their mind. It's like, well, what do you want? Yeah.
So that makes me just want to get, to push the local and state message, both the culture around talking about it. Like we just need to stop talking about that national stuff and focus on state and local stuff, and, do it with. It's just like you can't approach it like the people who don't want to raise the gas tax are evil jerks. It's like they're your neighbors who need to be convinced, and like so that's what if that's your priority, then that's your job, to get involved in that.
All right. Well, hey, I'm super glad you took the time to talk to me. It's East Coast, so it's a little after 9 there. If something more particular might come up in the future, it'd be cool if I could shoot you an email and harass you and then bring you on again to chat. But I'm super grateful you came on. Your book has been awesome. It's like had me make a real measurable change. If by some chance we manage to get a guy elected as mayor in Omaha, then you will be the sole cause for why Omaha has a Democratic mayor on the back of everything. So that's it's super awesome. You're really inspirational. I'm really happy I got to chat with you. Maybe I'll have more focused topics next time. This was just kind of like a more casual chat, but yeah.
Cool. Well, I'm going to do this with you. Thanks for having me.
Mm-hmm. Do you have real quick? Do you have like what's like one platform or thing you'd like to promote? I know you have a Twitter. You've got a book. Is there anything else?
Just I would love for people to go to library or bookstore and get my book, because I try to work through. Everyone comes to this conversation about politics and they're kicking and screaming about why what we're all doing online is okay, and we don't have to do something more. And I tried to write the book with that person who's like, wants my message but doesn't want it in mind, and to try to bring them along, and try to confront like all the reasons they're too busy, it's not important, all the reasons they have for not getting involved in politics, and try to deal with that. So I guess I would just say, forget following me on Twitter or anything like that. Just get the book.
Gotcha. Awesome. I'll link your book in all the chats. Hopefully you get a little bump today. Thanks a lot for chatting. I really appreciate it. One final quick question.
Yeah.
How do you, I've explicitly not said it because I haven't heard it anywhere. How do you pronounce your first name?
Eitan.
Eitan. Okay. Thank you very much, Eitan, for the chat. Hopefully we'll chat again in the future. I'll see you later.
Okay, take care.
Bye. Remember to hit that like and subscribe, and don't forget the notification bell so that my videos show up right in your feed. Jesus Christ!